Vishnupada Paramahamsa Parivajagacharya Ashtatara Satashi Shrimadi's Divine Grace Abhayachan Aravinda Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai Krantaraj Srimad Bhagavatam Ki Jai Shri Shri Radha Gopinath Bhagavan Ki Jai Jai Nitai Guru Premanande Hare Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Reading from Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto number 3, Chapter 9, Text 42. Aham Atma Atmanam Data Preshta San Prayasamapi Ato Mai Ratim Kuryat Deha Dir Yat Krite Priyaha Aham Atma Atmanam Data Preshtaha san prayasam api Ato mai ratim kuryat Deha dir yat krite priyaha Aham atma atmanam data Preshta san prayasam api Ato mai ratim kuryat Deha dir yat krite priya Aham atma atmanam data Preshtaha san prayasam api Ato mai ratim kuryat Deha diryat krite priya Aham atmatmanam data Preshta san prayasam api Ato mai ratim kuryat Deha diryat krite priya Aham atmatmanam data Preshta san prayasam api Ato mai ratim kuryat Deha diryat krite priya. Translation and purport by His Divine Grace Abhayachan Aravinda Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Jagadguru Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Translation. I am the super soul of every individual and I am the supreme director and the dearest. People are wrongly attached to the gross and subtle bodies, but they should be attached to me only. It's a long purport, so we'll chant Mangalachan and go through it together. Om Jnanatimirandasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurun Militam Yena Tasme Shri Guruve Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamayam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yuta Padakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunathanvitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padhan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakhan Vitamscha He Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dina Bandhu Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Vanchakalpatrupyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Evacha Patitanam Bhavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shrivas Adi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda. Hare Krishna 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 Hare Hare, Hare Rama 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 Hare Hare, Hare Krishna 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 Hare Hare, Hare Rama 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 Hare Hare, Hare Krishna 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 Hare Hare, Hare Rama 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 Hare Hare. Okay, so this is the purport to Canto 3, Chapter 9, Text 42. The Supreme Lord, the Personality of Godhead, is the dearest in both the conditioned and liberated states. When a person does not know that the Lord is the only dearmost object, then he is in the conditioned state of life. And when one knows perfectly well that the Lord is the only dearmost object, he is considered to be liberated. There are degrees of knowing one's relationship with the Lord depending on the degree of realization as to why the Supreme Lord is the dearmost object of every living being. The real reason is stated in Bhagavad Gita, chapter 15, text 7. Mamaivamsa jiva loke jiva bhuta sanatana. The living entities are eternally parts and parcels of the Supreme Lord. The living entity is called the Atma, and the Lord is called the Paramatma. The living entity is called Brahman, and the Lord is called the Parabrahman, or the Parameshwara. Ishvara Parama Krishnaha. The conditioned souls who do not have self-realization accept the material body as the dearmost. Okay, before we continue speaking about that aspect, so far Prabhupada is touching upon, we're reading from a section of Bhagavatam where Krishna is reciprocating with Lord Brahma's prayers. So after Lord Brahma's prayers, the crux of it being that he does not want to be entangled by material existence or entangled by the effort of creating the material creation and becoming puffed up in thinking that he is the doer and thinking that he is the creator. Rather, he is submitting his position before the Lord, saying that I'm ready to do whatever service is required, but please allow me to always remember you. Please give me the potency to be able to perform the service. In other words, please let me become an instrument of your desires. So Krishna reciprocates with Lord Brahma by giving him instructions, teaching him how to remain fixed in Krishna consciousness despite having to perform activities in the material world. Which is a very interesting concept, because unless we understand the nature of the Lord, understand the nature of the living entity in relationship with the Lord, and understand the material energy in relationship with the Lord, it's very difficult to understand how this material cosmos works. How to perform activities within the material cosmos and not be attached or not be affected. Because by nature, any activity performed in this material world causes a reaction. And that reaction then brings forth other actions, and then those actions then breed more reactions. And in this way, this vicious cycle continues and one is not able to come out of it. But to be able to perform an activity within the material world and not get a reaction, in other words, not to become entangled in the material world in the future, that is a revolutionary concept in material existence. And that is only possible when one is engaged in the service of the Lord. That, as we read in Bhagavad Gita chapter 3, that when one performs that activity for the purpose of pleasing Yagya or Vishnu, then that activity becomes free from karma, or rather it frees one from bondage. Whereas those who perform activities simply for the self, simply for one's own sense gratification, they become even more entangled. So Krishna gives Brahma instructions on how to see him at all places and at all circumstances. Similarly, in Bhagavad Gita, Arjuna is given instructions by Krishna in the section of the 7th chapter or the 9th chapter, where Krishna is trying to induce Arjuna to see or to develop more affection for him by explaining his glories in the material in his connection or his pastimes in material existence. To the extent he says, Maya tatam idam sarvam jagadavyaktamurtina matstani sarva bhutani nachaham nacha naha tesh vavastitaha nachamatstani bhutani pashyame yogamaishwaram bhutabrin nacha bhutasto mamatma bhuta bhavana. So in that section we see how Krishna is talking about how he's present within material existence, how he's the support of material existence, and how everything rests on him, but at the same time he is not there. In fact, I think it's Chaitanya Prabhu mentions that it gives us the absolute truth, the Vadanti tat tattvavidas tattvam yad jnanam advayam brahmeti paramatmeti bhagavaniti sabjate. That the three aspects of the absolute truth are explained in these verses. That by his Brahman feature, he's all-pervasive throughout the whole of existence. So everything rests in him in that sense. And by the Paramatma, then he also enters into material existence between every atom, in every atom, and sustains it. But as a Bhagavan aspect, he's not there. So although all-pervasive and all the energy is dependent upon him, he's not dependent upon the energy. He's not affected by it. So in this way, Krishna gives similar instructions to Lord Brahma. And so in this verse, coming to the end of this prayers, Krishna's beseeching Lord Brahma to focus on serving Krishna or serving him with affection and love, to focus on worshipping him in that mood. And in this verse we see how Krishna is mentioning to Brahma, actually the only thing we should be attached to is Krishna. The only thing we should be attached to is the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Because he is the super soul of every living individual, and he is the Supreme Director and the dearest. Bhoktaram yagyatapasam sarvaloka maheshwaram suhridam sarvabhutanam yatma mam santim richati. That Krishna says in this one, I am the enjoyer, proprietor, and the best friend, and one who knows this will attain peace. That's the beginning platform. When you go further and understand the qualities and the pastimes of the Lord, then naturally one is able to understand more about the Lord. Ye yata mam papadyate tam sate vipajamyaham. That according to one's advancement, realization, relationship with the Lord, to that degree the Lord reciprocates with the living entity. So therefore Prabhupada is mentioning this very interesting point. It's like one of those sentences that you can just meditate on forever. Of course, meditating on every sentence is there, but this one strikes the most at this point in time. There are degrees of knowing one's relationship with the Lord depending on the degree of realization as to why the Supreme Lord is the dearmost object of every living being. So Prabhupada is saying there are degrees of knowing one's relationship with the Lord, and the degree to which we learn or know our relationship with the Lord depends on our realization as to why the Supreme Lord is the dearmost living being, or the dearmost object of every living being. And Prabhupada now in the rest of this paragraph carefully lays out for us why Krishna is considered to be the dearmost living being. Atma Atmanam. Aham Atma Atmanam Dhata. Why? Prabhupada's carefully mentioning it here. We'll go through this purport. In fact, in the 10th canto Srimad Bhagavatam, just during the Brahma Vimohan Leela pastime, after Brahma had stolen the calves and the cowherd boys, at that particular point in time, Krishna expanded himself into many cows and calves and cowherd boys and entered into Vraja. And Shukadeva Goswami explains to Parikshit Maharaj that actually all the mothers of the cowherd boys and all the mothers of the calves, the cows, they experienced more affection than they would have by receiving their own children, because they loved Krishna as if he was their own child. In fact, everyone's existence in Vraja was dependent on their relationship with Krishna. So, as we see in the pastime when Krishna was bound up by Kaliya, practically everyone there witnessing the scene fell down unconscious, except for Lord Balaram, who laughed, thinking that, see, he's playing with such an insignificant living being as a snake. He's not playing with me. He's playing with me as Ananta Shesh. What is this insignificant living being known as Kaliya, the snake? So, you can see their attachment for Krishna. In fact, before that even happened, before they even came and saw what happened, it's mentioned that when Krishna was stuck between the coils of Kaliya, at that time bad omens had appeared throughout Vrindavan. And everyone in the district of Raja started to run towards that Kaliya Ghat, to that place where Krishna was fighting Kaliya. And it's mentioned that they were fearing the worst, that something had happened to Krishna. They weren't thinking something happened to my son, something happened to my family member, something happened to this neighbor. Their attachment was to Krishna. As soon as they saw bad omens, they thought something's wrong with Krishna. Because he was the dearmost of their existence, the dearmost object of their existence. So coming back to the Brahma Vimohana Leela, at that time Parikshit Maharaj was asking Shukadeva Goswami, how is this that they're suddenly showing so much more affection to their children who are Krishna than their own children? How is that possible? So then this is what Prabhupada's explaining here. We're going to read through how Krishna is the self of the self. And why is it that the living entity conditioned in material existence is finding the body the dearmost, and how one should transfer or understand that actually, or find out why they consider the body the dearmost, and how they should understand the Supersoul and beyond the Supersoul Krishna as the dearmost. So here Prabhupada is mentioning the living entity is called Atma and the Lord is called Paramatma. The living entity is called Brahman and the Lord is called Para-Brahman, or the Parameshvara, Ishvara Parama Krishna. So this is an important point to note, because in this section, when Krishna expands himself in the cowherd boys and the calves, the Mayavadis will often take, or the Mayavadi tendency will often take off, understanding or thinking that we are also Krishna. See, Krishna expanded himself, the Brahman expanded himself into other calves and cowherd boys exactly like the previous ones. So therefore, the previous cowherd boys, they were also Brahman, and everything is one in that sense. And so naturally, the affection that they have for their sons is because they are themselves Brahman. All these speculative tendencies come into existence. So therefore, Prabhupada is clarifying this point, that Atma Atmanam, that he is the super soul of every individual. In the prayers of the personified Vedas, Prabhupada goes to extreme lengths, or rather the personified Vedas themselves go to extreme lengths of differentiating the super soul from the Atma, or the individual soul. To the extent that you'll see pages and pages of just Prabhupada explaining how material existence is not false, it's temporary, and how the soul is separate or individual, being a part and parcel of the Supreme Soul, Paramatma. And so Prabhupada, the prayers of the personified Vedas conclude, but at this section I found something interesting that I'd never heard before. Prabhupada talks about the differences between the Atma and Paramatma, and that one of the differences is that as Krishna tells Arjuna that many, many births you and I have taken, I remember them all, but you don't. And Prabhupada explains that cause of forgetfulness is death. Because Krishna does not forget, he does not die, and because Krishna does not die, he does not forget. Whereas a living entity, because of having to accept another material body, forgets. And you can understand that from lifetime to lifetime, or you can understand it even within this current lifetime. That we've forgotten what it's like to be as a child because we've changed body. So that body is dead and we have accepted another body. So Prabhupada's mentioning here, or mentioning in the Krishna book, that forgetfulness is a result of death. Anyway, so that's one of the differences between Paramatma and Atma. Another difference Prabhupada says is that the super soul is full of Sad Aishwarya, so also Sad Aishwarya Purna. He has Ashta Guna and he has Ashta Siddhi in full. So 6, 8, 8. And the 6 opulences we all know: wealth, strength, fame, beauty, knowledge, renunciation. And the 8 kinds of perfection we all know: Anima, Mahima, Lagima, Prapti, Prakamya, Ishita, Vashita, Kama, Vasayitva. But the 8 transcendental qualities, that's not often something we hear of. And Prabhupada mentions in the paragraph, he says, these are the 8 transcendental qualities which distinguish the Atma from the Paramatma. That Krishna cannot be polluted by sinful activities. Krishna never dies. Krishna never becomes old. Krishna is never subject to lamentation. Krishna is never hungry. Krishna is never thirsty. Whatever he desires is perfectly lawful, and whatever he decides cannot be changed by anyone. These are the 8 transcendental qualities Krishna possesses that distinguish him from the living entities. And he possesses them in full, of course. So, knowing this, one is able to understand the next point Prabhupada makes in this purport. That the conditioned souls who do not have self-realization accept the material body as the dearmost. Okay, so those who are conditioned, they don't understand that Krishna exists, or rather they've forgotten that Krishna exists. They think themselves in that position. And they forget themselves, their identity as the spirit soul. So what do they think? This body is all in all. So therefore they're on the Annamaya platform. You've heard of this, the 7 koshas? Annamaya, Pranamaya, Jnanamaya, Vijnanamaya, Anandamaya. The 5 koshas, or the 5 coverings. And this is again by the prayers of personified Vedas. They mention that in the beginning stage it's Annamoy, simply thinking about how to maintain the body with food. Then Pranamoy, maintaining the life, or maintaining the existence of the body. Then comes Jnanamoy, understanding the self. Vijnanamoy, realization, proper realization of the self. And then Anandamoy, being situated in Krishna consciousness. So this Annamoy platform is mentioned here, Annamoy and Pranamoy, that this living entity is attached to the body as being the dearmost object. Otherwise, because we know, if we lose a hand, lose a limb, then we know we won't be able to enjoy this body. So therefore it's considered to be the dearmost, because that's how we'll be able to enjoy in the material existence, Anandamaya Abhyasat. So then Prabhupada continues, the idea of the dearmost is then spread all over the body, both concentrated and extended. The attachment for one's body and its extensions, like children and relatives, is actually developed on the basis of the real living entity. As soon as the real living entity is out of the body, even the body of the most dear son is no longer attractive. So Prabhupada's mentioning here that when one is attached to the body, everything in relationship to the body becomes a source of affection. Yasatma buddhi kunapeti dhatuke swadikkalatra deshibome ijjati yatirtha buddhi salilena karhichit janeshva vignesha sa eva gokara. Krishna says to the sages at Kurukshetra, he tells them that actually those who are too bodily conscious, they think the 3 dhatus, or the body, to be the self. Yasatma buddhi kunapeti dhatuke that they consider the place of birth worshipable, or in other words, consider any idols made of earth worshipable. Yatitta buddhi salilena karhichit, that they go to places of pilgrimage simply to take bath and not hear from the saintly persons. Janeshu vigneshu sa eva gokara. So such persons are no different from cows and asses, animals. In other words, they are on the platform of Annamoy, simply thinking about the food that enters their mouth, and Pranamoy, their existence. So such a person, when they die, or living entities out of the body, it's mentioned that when the living entity comes out of the body, even the dearmost object of that body that they had occupied before no longer becomes attractive. What to speak of their own body? Therefore, the living spark or eternal part of the Supreme, the real basis of affection, and not the body. Let me read that again. Therefore, the living spark or the eternal part of the Supreme is the real basis of affection, and not the body, because the living entities are also parts of the whole living entity. The Supreme Living Entity is the factual basis of affection for all. One who has forgotten the basic principle of his love for everything has only flickering love because he is in Maya. The more one is affected, more is one affected by the principle of Maya, the more he is detached from the basic principle of love. One cannot factually love anything unless he is fully developed in the loving service of the Lord. So Sukadeva Goswami expands more on this, that the self the soul finds the body to be the source or the dearmost because it uses the body for enjoyment. But when one is realized in understanding the self and Paramatma, then one realizes that actually the source of the self is Paramatma. So you can keep going that way. They think they're the body, but what's the source of the body? The desires of the soul. The soul. And because of the soul, the body exists. So therefore they protect the soul. And the soul, source of the soul becomes the super soul. And that's even more the more of a dearmost object, because the self or the soul is dependent on the super soul. And understanding this is the basic principle of love. So therefore one becomes attached to the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Therefore the residents of Raja found more affection for the calves and cowherd boys who were Krishna himself than their own sons and calves. Because he is the self of the self, and he is the actual object of affection. But the problem is the more and more we're detached from this, then one factually cannot love anything unless he's fully developed in the loving service of the Lord. So Prabhupada's bringing it back to this point. Unless you develop your love of Godhead, it is not possible to love other living entities. Because you'll only be able to love other living entities by seeing them in relationship with the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So that's this first paragraph. Prabhupada's talking about how Krishna is Atma, Atmanam, the super soul of the individual living entity, the self of the self. Now here Prabhupada's going to talk about love of the Supreme and how one must have it. And the last paragraph of the purport, Prabhupada's going to talk about how the Mayavadis are unable to see or develop that love, but the devotees are able to do it. So this is the second paragraph. In the present verse, stress is given to focusing love upon the Supreme Personality of Godhead. The word kuryat is significant here. This means that one must have it. This reminds me of a verse from Chaitanya Charitamrita. It's by Rupa Goswami, but it's quoted by Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami. Let's see if I can find it for you. In fact, this verse, the first line of this verse, Prabhupada has translated to Krishna consciousness. Krishna rasabhavita mati. Let's see. One second. Okay, let's go. This is Madhya Lila, chapter 8, text 70. Madhya 8. So this is between Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and Ramananda Roy. Text number 70. Okay, so the verse is that Krishna Bhakti Rasa Bhavita Mati Kriyatam Yadi Kutopi Labhyate Tatta Loyam Apimulyam Ekalam Janma Koti Shukriterna Labhyate. Pure devotional service in Krishna consciousness cannot be had even by pious activities in hundreds and thousands of lives. It can be attained only by paying one price, that is intense greed to obtain it. If it is available somewhere, one must purchase it without delay. So this reminds me of a verse that Sukadeva Goswami tells Parikshit Maharaj when just before Aghasura, the killing of Aghasura, Krishna is playing with the cowherd boys in the forest of Braja, and there Sukadeva Goswami tells Parikshit Maharaj that these cowherd boys are so fortunate after performing so many lives of pious activities. And these pious activities are not what we know as good and bad activities given in the Karma Kanda. Rather, these pious activities are transcendental pious activities. Those activities which develop bhakti or bhakti credit, purification of the heart and devotion to the Lord. There, Sukadeva Goswami explains that that Supreme Personality of Godhead is seen in different ways by different living entities. That Maya Shitanam Narakaradena, that I can't remember how the verse starts. But there Sukadeva Goswami is mentioning that the cowherd boys, they saw Krishna as a friend, but only after many, many lifetimes of pious activities were they able to associate with him as a friend. So here, pure devotional service in Krishna consciousness cannot be had even by pious activity, hundreds and thousands of the lives, means that we're dealing with kriyatam. Kriyatam, or activities in material existence. Janma koti sukriti na labhyate. That by pious activities, or in other words, karma khanda, one cannot obtain Krishna consciousness, only by performing devotional service. So Prabhupada is saying here, the word kuryat is significant here. This means that one must have it. So what is the mood? That if it's available anywhere, Krishna consciousness, Krishna prem, love of Godhead, if it is available anywhere, purchase it at any cost. Take it, go and get it as quick as possible. It is just to stress that we must have more and more attachment to the principle of love. The influence of Maya is experienced by part and parcel of the spiritual entity, but it cannot influence the supersoul, the Paramatma. The Mayavadi philosophers, accepting the influence of Maya on the living entity, want to become one with the Paramatma, but because they have no actual love for Paramatma, they remain ever entrapped by the influence of Maya and are unable to approach the vicinity of Paramatma. This inability is due to their lack of affection for the Paramatma. So we hear that when the Dhyana Yogi or the Ashtanga Yogi gets to the platform of Samadhi, when he performs his meditation, when he's perfected, then he's able to see the Supersoul. At that time, there are two types of yogis. One who sees the Supersoul and then thinks, I should serve him, and the other one who thinks that I am him. Of course, one who thinks I am him has no affection for the Lord. In fact, it's mentioned that by the prayers of the personified Vedas themselves, that one who performs all this meditation, who performs all types of austerities just to be able to meditate on the Lord, if by doing so, then is unable to sort of see the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Although performing such meditation and austerities and penance, and one does not see the Supreme Personality of Godhead, then all of the activities that they performed is useless. Just like having a necklace and having a jeweled locket on the necklace and not realizing whether the locket exists there or not makes the whole necklace useless. Similarly, by performing meditation, austerities and penances without aiming for the pleasure of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, all of such activities become useless. So in this way, their inability is due to their lack of affection for the Paramatma. A rich miser does not know how to utilize his wealth, and therefore, in spite of his being rich, in spite of his being very rich, his miserly behavior keeps him everlastingly a poor man. On the other hand, a person who knows how to utilize wealth can quickly become a rich man, even with a small credit balance. So this brings or relates to the section where Rupa Goswami explains that Yukta Vairagya and Falgu Vairagya. That Yukta Vairagya is when a living entity, so this is the core principle. The problem between the Vaishnava scholars and the Vaishnava philosophers and the impersonalists, that they say that this material existence is false and it is illusion. But the Vaishnava philosophers understand that this material existence may be illusory, it's temporary, but it's real. Because it comes from the Supreme Lord who is real, the truth. So an object or a byproduct or the energy of the truth is also truth. So how does Rupa Goswami explain this? He says that, you see, those who are false renounced, they will take the material existence and then they'll say it has no value. Brahman Satya Jagat Mithya. They'll neglect material existence and reject it and try to perform their activities. Whereas the Vaishnavas, they understand the material existence in its proper position as an energy of the Lord to be used in the worship of the Lord. So they utilize material existence. So for them, there's no such thing as favorable or unfavorable. A favorable situation is when they're able to use material existence or material creation in Krishna's service. An unfavorable situation is when they're able to use the material existence in Krishna's service, although they feel inconvenienced by it. So for them there's no difference. For them, they understand unfavorable situation is by the hand of the Supreme Lord, and they will use it. They will then make use of the bad bargain and engage in the service of the Lord. In that way, one is able to see the pure devotion of the living entity or the advanced Krishna conscious practitioner. But the Mayavadi, as I mentioned before, have false renunciation. They're unable to use material existence to further progress in spiritual life. And Prabhupada gives this amazing example. I don't ever remember reading this or hearing it, but it stuck out when I was reading it. Prabhupada says, take a millionaire, and a millionaire will have $1 million or $1 million $1 notes with him. $1 million $1 notes with him. And that this millionaire, from holding these notes, it appears that he's just simply holding a bunch of paper or a bunch of plastic. That's all he's holding. So one who does not have proper knowledge, who's not situated properly, will then simply see, what's the point of holding such plastic, holding such paper? Just throw it. There's no use having so much paper. What use is there? So for them, they'll find little value in those papers. But one who is in knowledge and understands the value of those $1 notes will then utilize it for their benefit. Such a person is properly situated in knowledge. In the same way, this material existence may appear to be illusory and temporary, but one who is in knowledge will know how to use it, know its value. Whereas one who does not know the position of material existence will not be able to use material existence because they don't know its value. And Prabhupada then finishes it off by saying that the value of the currency notes comes from the authority of the government. Similarly, material existence's position or its value as being part of the truth comes from it emanating from the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So in this way, the living entity should understand that we shouldn't be misers. We should be not kripanas but brahmanas. We should know how to utilize everything in Krishna's service. And that is a great art that the Supreme Lord will bestow upon the living entity. And in this next paragraph, we'll wrap up with this one, this last paragraph, Prabhupada's explaining a bit about the capacity in which one is able to reciprocate with the Lord's affection. Prabhupada often mentions, his father says that Krishna has 10 hands. If he wants to take something away from you, you can't stop him. But Krishna has 10 hands, and if he wants to give you something, how much can you handle? How much can you take with your 2 hands? So in the same way, this third paragraph now, Prabhupada's explaining how to develop that capacity to be able to understand the Lord as the dearmost object. Remember, there are degrees of knowing one's relationship with the Lord depending on the degree of realization as to why the Supreme Lord is the dearmost object of every living being. This is the crux of this purport, or what I'm trying to explain in this class, I guess. That Krishna is mentioning in the verse that I am the super soul of every individual. I am the supreme director and the dearest. People are wrongly attached to the gross and subtle bodies, but they should be attached to me only. How do we develop this? Prabhupada is explaining the principle. There are degrees of knowing one's relationship with the Lord, depending on the degree of realization as to why the Supreme Lord is the dearmost object of every living being. So one must realize how Krishna is the dearmost object. And how one realizes, Prabhupada will now continue in the purport. The eyes and the sun are very intimately related because without sunlight, the eyes are unable to see. But the other parts of the body, being attached to the sun as a source of warmth, take more advantage of the sun than do the eyes. So Prabhupada is making the point. Without possessing affection for the sun, the eyes cannot bear the rays of the sun. Or in other words, such eyes have no capacity to understand the utility of the sun's rays. So although one feels the warmth of the sun, one is unable to see the sun or relate with the sun on a personal level, so to speak, because of their lack of capacity. Again, Krishna, if he wants to give something to you, how much can you take? And if Krishna wants to take something from you, how much can you hold back? Similarly, the empiric philosophers, despite that, so now Prabhupada is explaining the other hand. Prabhupada is explaining the devotee. He's going to explain the devotee how they're able to see the sun. But he's now explaining how those who are not devotees are not going to be able to experience that affection of the Lord. Similarly, the empiric philosophers, despite their theoretical knowledge of Brahman, cannot utilize the mercy of the Supreme Brahman because they lack affection. So many impersonal philosophers remain everlastingly under the influence of Maya because although they indulge in theoretical knowledge of Brahman, they do not develop affection for Brahman, nor do they have any scope for development of affection because of their defective method. So this is something we should take to mind, that we are given Krishna consciousness in a certain format. You see, acharyas, they practice Krishna consciousness according to proper principles. And they hand those principles down to their disciples. This is the Guru Parampara. And one must follow the previous acharyas in this way. To the extent one is able to follow the previous acharyas in the higher rungs of devotion, the do's and don'ts, the regulations of the Vedic literatures are not applicable to them. But they're still bound by the principles given by the previous acharyas. So the Vedic, or the Veda Vada Rata Partha, the Veda Vada Rata, those persons who follow the ritualistic principles given in the Vedas, there are do's, there are don'ts, so on and so forth. But for those in the higher stage of Bhakti, Prabhupada explains, they're not concerned with the list of do's and don'ts, rather they're maintained by following the footsteps of the previous acharyas. Their qualities, their actions are on the transcendental platform. Therefore, Prabhupada says, Acharya mam vijaneyam navamanyeta karhichit. That's why Krishna says that you should take the Acharya to be as me, equivalent to me. Because they're performing their devotional service on the transcendental platform following the principles of the previous Acharyas. But here's the thing, if one indulges in theoretical knowledge without practice, if one makes a twist in their Krishna consciousness without following the rule, the prescription, one thinks that I can, adjust it here, adjust it there, and it'll be fine. For such practitioners, for them they will not develop affection because of their defective method. Unless you follow the authority or the spiritual master, the authority in Krishna consciousness, the mentor, and the guru, one is not able to traverse the path of material existence to developing love of Godhead. It is not possible. Because to develop love of Godhead means to come to the platform being able to sacrifice your own desires for the pleasure of the Lord. And if you want to sacrifice your own pleasures or so-called desires for the pleasure of the Lord, then that means that you need to be able to do whatever He wants and reject what you want to do. But if you perform devotional service with what you want to do in mind, how can you expect to develop unalloyed, loving devotional service to the Lord? When the whole concept of love is for His pleasure, whatever He wants you to do. So therefore, the people, Prabhupada is giving the extreme or the classic case of those who are impersonalists, who understand that, or who cannot understand the personality of Godhead. For them, they have no scope of development for affection because of their defective method. In other words, impersonalism is simply another form of selfishness. Now here Prabhupada is going to explain the other extent, how one is able to see the Lord and develop affection for Him. A devotee of the Sun God, even though devoid of eyesight, can see the Sun God as he is even from this planet, whereas one who is not a devotee of the Sun cannot even bear the glaring sunlight. Similarly, by devotional service, even though one is not on the level of a jnani, one can see the personality of Godhead within himself due to his development of pure love. In all circumstances, one should try to develop love of Godhead, and that will solve all contending problems. So, I'll finish with 2-3 points. First point here is that Prabhupada says, see the Archa Vigraha, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Shri Shri Radha Gopinath. The yogis try for many, many lifetimes to be able to see them within the heart. But practitioners of devotional service, bhakti, we're able to see that Supreme Lord directly. He's here directly. Even though we may not be jnanis, we may not be yogis, we may be the 4th class, 5th class personalities of Kali Yuga, still we're able to see the Supreme Personality of Godhead only because of development of pure love. Simply because if we follow the instructions of the previous acharyas, follow Prabhupada's instructions, Krishna is present before us. We're able to see Him. The moment we stray away, we'll just simply see earth, stone, marble. We will not see the Supreme Personality of Godhead, because the affection disappears. It no longer becomes about Krishna consciousness. It becomes about myself, I and my consciousness. So that's one point you can understand, that if you follow in the footsteps of the previous Acharya, follow the instructions given by the Acharyas, then one is able to develop love of Godhead very easily. It's a very simple process. Prabhupada says it's very simple for the simple, but difficult and hard for the complicated. This process of devotional service is very simple. One just simply follows the instructions of the spiritual master. Prabhupada says in so many of his letters, when he's writing to his disciples, just chant Hare Krishna, chant your 16 rounds, follow the 4 regulative principles, and follow the instructions of the spiritual master, and in that way you go home back to Godhead. Very simple formula, very simple to understand. But we complicate it because we have desires, we have wants, we have needs, so to speak. And that's what's causing our delay of attaining love. So how to develop this capacity, how to develop more love for Godhead despite being in this disadvantaged position. Prabhupada explains here that we need to develop the eyes or the capacity to understand the utility of the sun rays. Or in other words, there's an example given by Radhesham Prabhu, Ganesham Prabhu was explaining to me yesterday, that long story short, there's a very wealthy merchant and he has 2 sons. And one of the son is just simply thinking about how to take the position of the father. He's just simply thinking, I need to get to the position of the father and to be able to enjoy the wealth. Whereas the other son is simply thinking about the father's desires, what the father wants, and he develops the trust and the faith in the father. So naturally the father will give more of his wealth and possessions to the second son, knowing very well that the second son will utilize it properly. So in the same way, the Supreme Personality of Godhead will give more to the devotee because the devotee is surrendered to him. So this is the key point. You want to develop this realization as to why the Supreme Lord is the dearmost object of every living being, and to get over this gross concept that we are the subtle and the gross bodies, is to develop more surrender to the Supreme Personality of Godhead. If you develop your surrender, in other words, surrender means that you'll shut down your own plan-making factory and you'll go with the Lord's plan. In other words, you will sacrifice your own desires for the pleasure of the Lord. And that may be, if you're working outside, it may be giving your hard-earned money for the service of the Lord. It could be that even it's considered time is money. In other words, one's life energy, prana, is considered to be very valuable. Engaging that in the Lord's service. Preaching Krishna consciousness. Praner arte dira vacha shreyanam sadana, was it? Shreya sada acharanam. I can't remember that one. That praner arte dira vacha. With one's life energy, prana, arte, with one's